First of all, I'd like you to give your opinions on the first question.
I think the purpose of philosophy is quite diverse. It can be applied to an innumerable amount of fields. For example, in the medical field, you do need philosophy in speaking in terms of ethics, right? That's a big part of how hospitals operate. They have to make these tough decisions every day when they do have limited resources. I also think this applies to business, right? What counts as, an honorable business, or what counts as a business that is getting their, like, ESG is a great way of framing it, right? A lot of businesses value ESG, and I think that's highly correlated with, philosophy. And there are also obviously less contemporary or practical applications of philosophy and more conceptual, more theoretical, right? Whether that be, just talking about the fundamental principles themselves, debating about, the relevance or the credibility or the soundness of the arguments of, Aristotle or Socrates. Um, and I also think philosophy is very applicable in our personal lives, right? I mean, it can really be used to help us make decisions or try and justify or try to not justify uh, taking a certain personal action in our lives. Like this can be seen in a lot of Agnes Callard's work. I don't know if you've heard of her, but
Mhm.
yeah, a lot of her work center around those philosophical revelations or thoughts even um, related to her personal life, whether that be her unique romantic situation, right? I mean, her walking us through the process of how she came to that conclusion, or whether it be, her fears of, or I wouldn't say fear, but acceptance of, one day maybe she gets canceled. She wrote a New York Times article, I'm pretty sure, on, her personal thoughts about what she would do or how she would react in that situation. So I think all of these examples kind of illustrate the versatility of philosophy. It really expands to all types of fields.
Well, I think we can start with the roots of philosophy. So, philosophy is, if you look at the etymology, it's basically the love of wisdom, right? And I think there are two. Firstly, it's more about understanding the truth of things. For example, it's going to be in terms of people wondering whether the universe is actually a simulation or whether there are gods and things like that. The truth of this world, the more objective type of philosophy. And then there's a second type of philosophy, which is more moral and ethical. So, to add on to what you were saying about the moral and ethical side of philosophy, I think that Mm, I often use the analogy of a vector. So essentially, what I'm talking about is each person can be compared to a point or a coordinate on a graph. And each action that they take is a vector, and it changes them from A to A prime. And so essentially, each action you take changes kind of your morality. And so if you do a sin, if you sin or you do something good, then both of those contribute to a change in your character, which is your morality. And so I think the purpose of philosophy is to help people navigate that and help them to be as moral as possible. And especially since there are people with like differing types of moralities where some people might, for example, value honesty over other values in morality, they they need to be aligned with that type of morality. Sure, people can have different types of morality, but they need to be able to know how to actually achieve that. Now, the second type of conceptual thinking of, for example, is this world a simulation? I think that the purpose is really to understand our world. That way that we can understand ourselves better. Because if you understand, for example, the universe and all of that, it's sort of a context for ourselves, right? And I think that a lot of times you need a context to understand what is actually happening, right? I think in the Distance of the Moon, for example, it's a short story by Italo Calvino. It's a short philosophical story. And essentially, there's a guy who basically leaves the Earth in this sort of fantasy world, and he leaves onto a moon, which is personified as a person. But this person basically loses all of his identity once he leaves the Earth because he says something on the lines of what are we without a where, a when, a before and after, and I think an earth. But essentially, you need a context to really have meaning or value, right? And you need that context to really understand what your meaning and what your value is. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think we largely share the same opinion, especially on what you said at the start about navigating morals, know how to reach whatever, unique moral standard you might have or your organization might have. Um, I find your point about, treating philosophy as almost a foundation of meaning or value to be quite insightful, and it's a perspective I haven't really thought of before. So I'm just a bit curious in maybe a bit more elaboration or maybe a bit more explanation to that in terms of maybe like a modern context or some sort of situation or scenario that a lot of people can relate to, because I think one maybe confusion or misinterpretation of your view might be you need a like, you use philosophy to even understand like the context of a global conflict when you don't really need to. It's not necessarily a unique prerequisite, but I do quite agree with you in terms of its use as context for more abstract or more sentimental uh, concepts, like what is love, right? What does it mean to be loved, right? I think philosophy gives you a great foundation to start off of that, right? um yeah, so like maybe could you just further elaborate on it? uh I'm just very curious to uh, hear more of this argument.
So it's not necessarily that much of an argument. Mainly what I'm saying is that yes, I agree actually mostly with what you're saying, which is that it's used for more abstract kind of concepts such as love, for example, and it's not really used too much in a practical sense when you're talking about, for example, are we in a simulation, right? Honestly, I don't find these questions too useful, at least too applicable in our current society. You can use them to understand things better, but they're not as applicable, right? So I think that often, like as you've already said, the context that you need for a specific situation might not really include, for example, understanding the universe, right? You don't need to understand the universe in order to understand some sort of war that's happening on the earth, right? So I think there's a scope to it, but for in a general sense of just understanding yourself and your place in this universe is quite useful. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that does satisfy uh my curiosity about that point.
Mhm.
How about we move on to the second question then?
Okay.
How is the purpose of philosophy fulfilled? What are your thoughts?
Uh, I think that the purpose of philosophy is fulfilled when people disagree. I think that a lot of times we actually don't have the answers to things, and we can never achieve the answers. And philosophy really gets deep into this, where, for example, you can't really know if there's a God. You can argue that it's unlikely or that it's likely, but you can't know whether there's a God outside of our own like little bubble, our Earth or our universe, right? And sometimes these questions can't be answered, but through disagreement, often we come to other conclusions. And we come to, for example, conclusions about uh, what humans are like, right? You can conclude a lot about humans just from the way that they argue their points and the way that they disagree with each other. And another another type is like type of way in which disagreement can help people to fulfill the purpose of philosophy is when disagreement actually does lead to conclusions, right? So for example, in terms of morality and ethics, these types of doctrines, they often can have conclusions. They often can have conclusions because they're more down to earth and practical, with not really practical, but applicable in our lives, right? So I think those situations, not only can disagreement help to get a conclusion, not only can disagreement help find like tangential conclusions and findings, they can also create new conclusions. And I think, for example, Eric no, Socrates talked about how the only thing I know is that I know nothing, right? And I think that that type of mentality is really important when you're going through philosophy, where your disagreements are simply your humble opinion, and you're basically basing that off of your own reasoning, but you're willing to see other people's reasoning and willing to change it if there are other types of reasoning that are more, for example, mm, more solid. Yeah.
All right. So you're more on your idea of like fulfillment of the purpose of philosophy is basically just discussion and putting your ideas to the test, right? Like exchanging your
Mm-hmm.
humble opinion with others in the marketplace of ideas, right?
Mm-hmm. And
Um,
I think not only that, but it specifically has to be about disagreement because when people are agreeing too much, I think that it just becomes the same thing over and over again. And then there's not really any purpose to it because there's no change. And philosophy is all about change, changing your own opinions and making it better. Yeah.
yeah, I think I actually wholly agree with you on this point. Um, so I'll just keep it short. I think, like you said, I think the purpose of philosophy is fulfilled if, you're in the constant pursuit of truth or the constant pursuit of improvement and refinement, like never settling for what you have, never being complacent. I think that is a fantastic point you brought up there. And um, I've grown, in the past year, I've grown incredibly interested in the subject of free speech and how maybe that is, first of all, that term is largely misinterpreted um, in the status quo, and also um, making the case for it in in by using philosophy or in the context of philosophical arguments. And there's that very famous saying, right? Like I may not agree with what you're saying, right? But I'll defend to my death your right to say it. And I think that is currently what is lacking is the fulfillment of the purpose of philosophy in the status quo. I think if more people were more open-minded, listen to people, even those who, have the most radical opinions, whether that be, someone from the KKK or, some sort of uh, extreme terrorist, right? I think that you you're it's inevitable you're not going to change their opinion by ignoring them, by shunning them, by um, defacing them, right, or degrading them. So might as well, give them a chance to, tell you why they think and what they think, as much as you disagree with them, and you try and you disagree. you try and find a common ground, or you try and prove why you think you're still correct after hearing their argument, right? I think I think the lack of that is the reason why we've had more political polarization here. And I think that also ties into the first question a lot, right? In terms of the importance of philosophy. I feel like the subject is often overlooked in terms of it being a little too abstract and too trivial and irrelevant to the status quo. But in fact, it can actually amend a lot of the social and political issues we have in the status quo.
Mhm.
So, I mean, do you have anything else to add about that? Do you agree with me on that take?
Yeah, I do agree with you. I think that not only not just to add though, I do think that, for example, you made the example of listening to a terrorist. I do think that there's actually another benefit to that, which is that even if your opinion doesn't change by the end of that discussion, you can still learn more, right? You can even if your opinion is like fundamentally the same, you can refine it to be more sharp, right? A pencil is still a pencil if you sharpen it, but it's a better pencil, right? So I think that's another important part of philosophy, right? Even if you're, for example, uh, let's say that you're a left-wing person and you're talking to someone from the right wing, right? And so the left wing, as a left-wing person, you might support certain ideologies such as abortion rights. And if you're talking to someone who doesn't support those, and at the end you still support abortion rights, then you're still probably going to have your opinion refined somewhat during that discussion. Yeah.
Mm. All right.
Okay.
Yeah, we can move on to the third
Yeah.
question.
So, what action should philosophers take to fulfill this purpose? Do you have any ideas?
Well, I think we already kind of knocked out one with the second question in terms of
Mhm,
open-mindedness, right?
mhm.
Engaging in the exchange of ideas on the marketplace.
Oh, I think,
Um,
wait, I
yeah,
think we just did the third question. Okay,
yeah,
let's move on to the fourth
essentially
question.
we did.
Yeah. What qualities of a philosopher make them more likely to take these actions? What do you think?
I think curiosity is definitely the most important quality of any philosopher. I think if you're not interested in what you're discussing about or researching about or reading about, first of all, you're not going to really spend the effort or the time and the thought into, forming your opinion or forming questions about the subject matter, right? And I think as a result of that, when you do engage in discussions, first of all, you're ill-informed to a certain extent, I think. And that would ultimately maybe lead to, your opinion not being entirely reflective of your morals, or, you're not really entirely fully engaging in the conversation because of your limitations in the knowledge of the subject. And I also think open-mindedness, as I stressed earlier, um, I think curiosity is a prerequisite to that. If you're not curious to learn about all the perspectives of the subject and spend the time thoroughly considering all of them, even the more extreme or often looked down upon, uh, certain ideas that are rightfully so, rightfully looked down upon, um, I think that um, you cannot be open-minded, right? You're not curious if that curiosity is not driving you. I don't
Mhm,
think there are any intellectual barriers per se in terms of, you need to know this and that. I think anyone can be a philosopher regardless of how much or little they read. Now, obviously, don't get me wrong, the more you read, maybe, the more informed you are, the better you have a better ability to, make complex arguments, right? But I think that we practice philosophy in our everyday lives, right? You know, deciding which friend to hang out, or deciding when to raise my hand, or whether or not I should hold the door for someone. We all make these small, seemingly minute, philosophical decisions in our head all the time. And I think that that is enough. That is a good enough testament to prove that I think anyone can be a philosopher, regardless of their academic or intellectual knowledge of philosophy as a subject.
Mhm. So to add on to that, I think you made a really good point about us always being sort of ill-informed when we take a discussion. And I think this is a very good mindset to have as for all philosophers, because everybody is basically in a bubble and there's a limit to their knowledge and perception, because we're not like gods or anything like that. And even God probably has limits to his perception. So we're all ill-informed to a certain degree. And the quality of a philosopher that makes them more likely to take these actions is assuming that they're ill-informed, right? So, for example, Socrates is like the prime example of this. He always believed that he was ill-informed. That's why he asked so many questions, and why he said that the only thing he knows is that he knows nothing. And I think you talking about curiosity also comes from that, because you're not going to be curious once you think that you know everything, right? And you're not going to be curious if you're complacent with your current knowledge, right? So I think that it's one big point is to be humble about what you know and what you can perceive, and then also to be curious. And I know they talk about critical thinking and open-mindedness, which is they're both really important, but actually more deeply, they're reflections of being humble and being curious. Because when you're curious and realize that you're ill-informed, you're more likely to be open-minded. And when you can really criticize yourself and criticize your thinking, that's also showing that you're humble with your own thoughts. And so, you know, people usually just throw out the words critical thinking and open-mindedness, and really more deeply, they're reflections of humility and curiosity, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
think I find your point on humility to be, very appealing. I was I like I'm gonna be honest, I was thinking about, adding on to your argument there about humility, but then you mentioned it because
Mhm.
I think that is an important aspect of what you were talking about. But maybe to spice up this conversation, I play devil's advocate, right?
Mhm.
Like, do you really have to have that humility or that be humble, and think you are less intelligent than others or just not intelligent at all? Because you brought up Socrates, right? I think in a lot of the dialogues or just dialogues similar to Socrates, um, I think I find a lot of times is there's a power dynamic in the sense where you know one would think oh look, I'm smarter than you, you're a little foolish, let me school you on this, right? I mean,
Mhm.
I think Plato's Crito is a great example of this, right? It's basically telling Crito, hey, you're a little bit of a fool right now, let me educate you on why you're misled and why you're wrong. Now, not that isn't necessarily you know a discussion with bad intentions or not a good model discussion necessarily, right? I mean, I think it could be argued, but you know there isn't much of that humility or that humbleness you talked about, but rather, a confidence in, you know, saying, to tell someone that they're ill-informed and say, I'm the smarter one here. Let me tell you why. Do you think, you know, a good philosopher could occasionally have that attitude or just wholly have that attitude? Because, if it clearly worked back then for the same philosopher you cited as a great example.
Mm. I think that philosophy has obviously two different impacts. It can impact the society and it can also impact yourself. Now what am I talking about here? So it can impact society by impacting the way that other people think. Socrates is a great philosopher because he impacted the way other people think. Now, there's another aspect of being a good philosopher, which is impacting the way you think. And so Socrates, he generally thought the same way over time, even though there are like elements of uh arrogance. And the thing is that he didn't really change the way he thought. And in that aspect, maybe you could really call him a bad philosopher. But he did help. There's like two aspects of this. He was a good philosopher as well, though, because he helped to change the way that other people think. So again, going back to the disagreements, the actions that philosophers should take to fulfill the purpose of philosophy is basically they disagree with each other. And those philosophers, they may be arrogant, but they disagreed with each other and they helped other people refine their opinions, which is a good cause for the rest of society. But one of the biggest impacts of philosophy is towards the philosopher himself. And I think that's a good philosopher a good philosopher is humble because a good philosopher also, at least in terms of like personal philosophy, it's very useful to be humble because that refines your own personal philosophy and the way that you think yourself. Even if you're helping society by having a consistent disagreement, it's not particularly useful to yourself or philosophy in that sense. Yeah.
All right. So I can kind of sense this tension or this, conflict between these two drastically different attitudes that both could constitute being a good philosopher. And it's a very case by case or a situational uh judgment on, whether or not that quality in that given moment is good or bad, right?
Yeah.
All right.
Do you have anything to add or
Like
no?
maybe a follow-up question to that would be, when how do you judge when to have which approach, right? Because they're obviously drastically different, you know? Because as far as I'm concerned, we can never assume that, an ill-informed or a morally distraught person cannot have very valuable uh arguments or opinions that will instead make us look like the fool, right? And vice versa. We might be talking to you might one day find yourself conversing with, you know, a world-renowned or very well-respected philosopher, right? And, they might find your arguments to be incredibly appealing, or you might find their arguments to be, morally misled or ill-informed, right? I mean, that's really the root of a lot of the disagreements among the greats, right? So, how do you like how do we judge when to have each opinion, or what would a virtuous philosopher or good philosopher make that judgment?
A judgment between confidence in your opinions and humility? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
I think that there's an there's obviously parts where philosophers aren't humble, but they're also confident. and situations where they're humble but not confident. But I think often the best philosophers are the people who are humble and confident. Now, what do I mean by this? So, being humble just means that you understand that you might not have all the knowledge, right? But your confidence comes from having the best reasoning. That's the thing. You might not have the best results. So here's what I'm saying. The reasoning is basically the process. And then what you conclude is the like B. So you're going from A to B through the process of the reasoning, right? And so essentially being humble is in your conclusion. And you think that your conclusion might have problems, but you can also be confident in your reasoning that it's much better than other people's. And that's an important thing to point out because I think Socrates was very confident in his reasoning. He was very confident in his way of questioning and all of that, right? Although he might not be very confident in terms of maybe what he concludes, right? He's pretty humble in terms of that. And I think there's the situation where you can, because reasoning is really all that we can know. Reasoning is all that we can really judge from our, like, from reasoning is all that we can judge in terms of its quality because we don't know everything to where we can know whether a conclusion is good or bad, but we can know whether reasoning is good or bad because we can think, right? So I think that's an important part, which is that you can be humble and confident at the same time. And often confidence can help you kind of sway people's opinions and change their ideas, which is also an important point, which is just the constant change that comes with the philosophy, constant change of people's ideas and their ways of thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that can also segue very perfectly into the fifth question on, how can one, gain those qualities of a good philosopher? Maybe you can just continue your train of thought there.
Okay. So about the idea of being confident in your own reasoning and being humble about your uh kind of conclusion, right? So I think there's one way to kind of get these qualities, which is that you need to actually have back backing of your confidence. I think that it's not really it's your confidence is like strongest when there's something to back it up. And so often your reasoning needs to be built up over time. And I think one way that people can do this is through actually just disregarding what everybody else thinks and constantly reflecting with yourself. And I think people can even act as a philosopher, like there's a two philosophers in their head. They can have those conversations within their own head and really come to those greater conclusions. And sometimes it doesn't even require, for example, a book where you have to have a conversation with the book, basically. You can have a conversation with yourself. And often, I think that's a great way to build your reasoning skills, which is also going to increase your confidence within your reasoning. And then to be humble in terms of what you conclude, I think this is just a mindset shift that people can be taught through, like, once people realize that they need this mindset, then they'll probably shift, like, basically immediately into this mindset of being humble with their thoughts. Now, the way that people realize this is through being shown that's they're in a bubble basically. And so sometimes if I give this example, which is that actually even God, if you are God, let's say, let's just assume that you're God, okay? God still is in a bubble. Does God know that he's not in a simulation where there's another God controlling him? He actually doesn't. He can't have knowledge beyond his own world. And so every single person, no matter how smart they are, or no matter how much what academic accolades they still have limits to their knowledge and their perception. And so I think it's just a mindset shift that is given to people once they know that they need that mindset. And so that's about the process and the conclusion, the mindsets that you need to have during both of those. But about previously talking about humility and what was it? Humility and curiosity. I think that curiosity and humility, they're both going to be now you humility is beneficial for uh oh, I already talked about humility, sorry.
Yeah.
So curiosity is beneficial to kind of drive that kind of philosophical inquiry, right? And so the way that we can foster curiosity is through actually showing the purpose of philosophy. I think the purpose of philosophy helps to drive that curiosity partly. And then the second thing is to show the kind of ideas that can be formed through philosophy, which is similar to the purpose, but not exactly because it like kind of generates a different effect for the person. Now, what do I mean by these two different ways to foster curiosity? Firstly, by showing the purpose of philosophy, we can show how being curious as one of the most important points to kind of achieve this purpose can actually help people to kind of how curiosity can help people to gain different understandings and different ideas. Because, for example, have you read a book for the first time and then a teacher explained it to you or a friend explained it to you, and then you realize a whole different world about the book? I think that some people, or at least maybe like more than 50% of the population has probably experienced something similar, right? Where a whole different world in this book is revealed to you. And I think philosophy can often have that effect. And once you have gotten that effect into your mind and you've really been shown how philosophy can change your understandings, then it's kind of like almost addictive, and it's really you really become curious about it because now you basically see that I can have this whole other world shown to me by being curious and being inquisitive. And so I think those are like the main 3 points. And then about having disagreements, I think that's again just about like confidence in terms of your conclusions, which I've already talked about. Yeah.
All right.
Um,
Yeah, I think I do agree with a lot of what you said. Um, especially on like how to instill these qualities. But I think it's a semi disagreement because I agree with everything you said. But I think that the prerequisite to all of that is just simply having a passion for learning. I think like let's say just use your book analogy, right? Or I think it applies to anything beyond just reading a book, right? I think that if people are not passionate to learn more or passionate to reread a book, of course, then it doesn't matter how many different outlooks or opinions you give them, they simply won't care. I think, this can be seen, um, at our school, right? I'm sure some of your peers in English class are simply disinterested or detached from those conversations about the meaning of the book or about an analysis about of a certain paragraph, right? they're just simply uninterested in learning more about it. They are just, you know, there to, make it through the day or, get a respectable grade. So I think that it does have to start young in terms of having that passion for learning. Now, I think how that passion is instilled in people is quite hard to pinpoint down in terms of like, how
Mm.
exactly you do that, which unfortunately does mean it's question begging, but I think that um, that's the point of philosophy is to, you know, ask those questions and, see where you land. For me personally, I think a passion for learning is, instilled by giving them, ensuring they're always, passionate to learn more, make learning very interesting from a young age, right? I think that's how you instill the lifelong passion for learning. But I'm sure there are countless people who disagree with me. But I think that however you get to that passion is um the prerequisite to everything you said.
Mhm. So, uh, I think one way to answer how to instill passion is firstly to go on a bit of a tangent. What do you think a passion for learning is?
Yeah, I think I explained it a little bit just now, but I guess I'll just reiterate it in terms of it's basically just being excited to learn about something, you know. Like
Mhm.
if you're playing a video game, right? You might be incredibly driven to, rank up or to, reach this milestone in the game or to pass this level or to beat the final boss or whatever, right?
Mhm.
And you're so focused on doing that, you're so determined on doing that, that, you spend so much time playing that video game. Oftentimes, in the blink of an eye, almost like an hour or two has passed, right?
Mhm.
Now, if that same sensation or that same determination, that same drive and really um, involvement in what you're learning, I think that is what a passion for learning is. You know, when you dive into this rabbit hole about a subject that you're so interested in that 1 or 2 hours, 2 3 hours pass by in the blink of an eye as well. Like when you're playing your favorite video game. I think that is what passion looks like.
Mhm. So, I think you talked about excitement and you compared passion to you use the analogy of a video game. So I think that video games, you use like leveling up and all of these ideas. These, I see a similarity between them, which is benefit and reward. So not exactly benefits because there's, I guess, not really a practical benefit, but there is reward and achievement, the sense of achievement, right? So I think excitement is important, but you need to, if in order to answer this question of how to instill these qualities of passion to learn, I think it's really important to think, what are you excited about? And sometimes it's you're excited about learning, but deeper than that, what are you excited about? You're actually often maybe excited about leveling up almost your understanding of things and refining it. Sometimes you're excited um, about simply learning the process of learning itself.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to think about, how do you make it seem like there's value, and how do you make it seem like you can achieve through these through philosophy and learning? Because when you see that there's achievement that can be gained through excitement, when you see that there's achievement or value that can be achieve through learning, then you're more likely to be having a passion for it because you see that it's giving back when you
Yeah.
put effort into there. And so just like a game where when you put more time into it, it'll give more rewards. You need to be seeing that when you put more time into learning, it gives you more rewards as well. And I think sometimes maybe people they don't feel as rewarded for what they're doing in learning, right? And maybe they're put down or something like that. That, or maybe they have imposter syndrome, something like that, where they basically have an achievement, but they don't take time to really let it sink in and reflect on that achievement. And they just go on to doing the next thing, which makes it seem makes it sometimes hard to let the reward, so called, sink in, or the value or achievement sink in. And that's why some people lose a passion for learning, I think, which
Mm.
is where they don't really see the value or the achievement. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a valid answer in terms of assigning value to learning. I think basically talked about we've basically answered the sixth question, I think, through question four and five. Like, I mean, are there any closing thoughts you would like to add?
Mm,
At least for me.
okay, so
Oh yeah, you go first, I
so
guess.
I guess I'll just talk very momentarily about how to make yourself realize that value and the achievement that you get from learning, which is that you really need to reflect on the value and reflect on the learning, which is because learning itself, if you're, for example, a rock and you learn something, let's just say a rock has a brain, but it has no emotions or anything like that, and it learns something. Well, what's the point? It can't see a point in that. So you have to be seeing the value and the achievement in that. And so the way that you see value and achievement in learning is you see, firstly, value is where you see that it can be applicable to your own life, I think, and the world around them. And when they do put those links together, I think it gives a lot more value to the that learning and makes it much more concrete. Whereas if you learn about something that you don't see how it applies to the real world, then you might not see as much value. And then on terms of achievement, I think it's really useful to reflect on where you what you used to think and what you think now, because sometimes you change your way of thinking so much, but you don't even realize it. And you need to reflect on that because otherwise that type of achievement is just going to go unnoticed. Like a game, for example, you I think in Brawl Stars you have like trophies and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So imagine if you increase your trophies, but you couldn't see what it increased to, or you couldn't see that you actually increased the amount of trophies you had. That wouldn't be useful, right? You
Yeah.
wouldn't feel achievement, right? Even if your trophies increased, but you if your trophies increased but you can't see it, then it's just useless to your sense of achievement. So in learning, it's the same thing. You need to be understanding when you learn. You need to be understanding your achievement and really see those trophy counts go up. You need to see how you've changed your way of thinking over time. And I think, yeah, that's the most important thing.
Yeah. I completely agree with you there. And like, I guess just to wrap up my thoughts, I think that definitely seeing achievement is really important. And I think you gotta know, you gotta be able to set goals for yourself. You gotta be able to know what you're trying to figure out. And I think that the purpose of philosophy and what actions one should take to fulfill these purposes are very important measures to be able to um, map out these achievements in the first place, and then to be able to reflect on them and reflect on the value of, you know, um, reaching that goal is very important. And yeah, that's all the time we have for today. But I think we can definitely, you know, discuss further maybe on, more practical applications of this or different, more specific aspects of philosophy in the future. So thank you for your time, Zachary.
Yeah, thank you too. Yeah, thank you.